On the anniversary of my wife's passing, I lit a candle and set out her favorite flowers. My daughter-in-law walked in, blew out the flame, and said, "We're not doing this grief parade every year." When I protested, she threw the flowers out the door. "She's gone, get over it," she snapped. She had no idea my son overheard everything from the hallway, and what he did after changed everything. I watched my father's hand shake as he struck the match, the small flame dancing in the darkness of our living room. The anniversary of my mother's death always hit him hardest, turning this gentle man into someone hollowed out by memories. He brought the flame to the white candle, his lips moving in silent prayer, and I could see the tears already forming in his weathered eyes. This ritual had become sacred to him over the past 3 years, a quiet moment to honor the woman who had been his entire world for 4 decades. My mother Maribel had been the kind of person who remembered everyone's birthday, who baked cookies for the mailman at Christmas, who could make you feel loved with just a glance. Losing her had shattered something fundamental in my father Elias, and these small ceremonies were the only way he knew how to keep her memory alive, to prove to himself that her existence had mattered, that 40 years of love couldn't just disappear into nothing. "She mattered," my father whispered, his voice breaking. "She still matters." The candlelight reflected in his eyes, making them shine with unshed tears. I stood in the hallway, watching through the doorway, my heart aching for him. I had my own grief, my own ways of missing her, but I tried to be strong for him. That's when I heard the sharp click of heels on hardwood. My wife Leora appeared from the kitchen, her expression cold and irritated, her arms crossed over her chest. She moved with purpose, her entire body language radiating impatience and contempt. Before I could even process what was happening, she leaned forward and blew out the candle with one harsh breath. The flame died instantly, smoke curling upward like a dying ghost, and the room plunged into semi-darkness. My father froze, the spent match still between his fingers, his face a mask of shock and hurt. "We're not doing this grief parade every year," Leora said, her voice sharp as broken glass. "It's pathetic." My father stared at her, his mouth opening and closing, unable to form words. The bouquet of white lilies he'd placed carefully on the side table seemed to mock the moment with their pure innocence. I felt something cold settle in my chest, a kind of fury I'd never experienced before, mixed with disbelief. This was my wife, the woman I'd married 2 years ago, the woman I'd thought I knew. But standing there in that moment, watching her dismiss my mother's memory like it was nothing more than an inconvenience, I realized I might not know her at all. "This is your mother-in-law you're talking about," my father said softly, his voice trembling. "She was a good woman, she deserved." Leora cut him off with a bitter laugh that made my skin crawl. "She's gone, Elias, dead, get over it already." She snatched the lilies from the table, their white petals pristine and beautiful, symbols of everything pure my mother had been. Then she walked to the front door, yanked it open, and hurled the flowers outside like they were garbage. I watched them scatter across the porch, petals separating from stems, beauty destroyed in an instant. The door slammed shut with enough force to rattle the pictures on the walls. My father stood there, frozen, his shoulders slumped, looking suddenly older than his 68 years. The spent match finally fell from his fingers, and I heard the small sound it made hitting the floor. That tiny noise somehow made everything more real, more final. I should have said something right then. I should have stepped into that room and defended my father, put my wife in her place, made her understand how deeply wrong she was. But I didn't. That's one of my flaws, always has been. I hold things in, let them simmer and boil inside me until they transform into something dangerous. My mother used to say I was too much like my father in that way, that we both kept our anger locked up tight until it had nowhere to go but inward. She'd been trying to teach me to speak up, to express myself in the moment, but I'd never quite mastered it. So instead of confronting Leora immediately, I stood in that hallway, hidden in shadow, and let the rage build. I watched my father slowly bend down to retrieve the match, saw him look at the empty space where the flowers had been, watched his hand reach out to touch the cold candle. Then he turned and walked toward his bedroom, moving like a man underwater, and I heard his door close with a soft click that somehow hurt worse than if he'd slammed it. Only then did I step into the living room. Leora was already on the couch, scrolling through her phone like nothing had happened, her face illuminated by the screen's blue glow. She didn't even look up. "Don't start with me, Adrian," she said flatly. "I'm not in the mood." I stood there, fists clenched at my sides, my jaw so tight I thought my teeth might crack. The words I wanted to say crowded my throat, fighting to get out, but I swallowed them down. This was another one of my flaws, this tendency to avoid confrontation until I'd thought everything through, planned every angle, considered every consequence. My mother had called it being thoughtful. My college roommate had called it being passive-aggressive. Either way, it meant I rarely exploded in the moment. Instead, I let things build, let my mind work through scenarios and possibilities, let strategy replace immediate emotion. "We'll talk about this later," I managed to say, my voice surprisingly steady. Leora glanced up then, and something in my tone must have registered because her expression shifted slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features. There's nothing to talk about, she said, but there was less certainty in her voice now. Your father needs to move on. It's been 3 years. This constant mourning isn't healthy. I didn't trust myself to respond. If I started talking, if I let even a little of what I was feeling leak out, I knew I'd say things I couldn't take back. Not yet. Not until I'd figured out exactly what I wanted to do about this. So I turned and walked away, hearing her call after me. Oh, now you're going to give me the silent treatment. Real mature, Adrian. I went to my home office and closed the door, leaning against it in the darkness. My hands were still shaking. I could hear my father moving around in his room down the hall, the soft sounds of a man trying to be quiet while his heart was breaking. This house, the one I'd grown up in, the one my father had shared with my mother for 40 years before she died, suddenly felt suffocating. When my mother passed from cancer 3 years ago, my father had been devastated. The first year was the worst. He'd barely eaten, barely slept, wandered the house like a ghost himself. I'd moved back home with Leora to help him, to make sure he didn't completely fall apart. Leora had seemed supportive at first, or at least I'd thought so. But over the past year, I'd noticed her making small comments, little jabs about my father's grief, suggestions that he needed to get back out there or stop dwelling on the past. I'd dismissed them as concern, as her not understanding the depth of a 40-year love, as cultural differences maybe, since Leora had grown up in a family that didn't show much emotion. But this was different. This wasn't concern or misunderstanding. This was cruelty, plain and simple, and it revealed something about my wife that I'd been willfully blind to. I sat down at my desk and turned on the computer, the screen's light harsh in the dark room. I needed to think, I needed to plan, because one thing had become crystal clear in that moment watching those flowers scatter across the porch. Something had to change, someone had to pay. My mother deserved better than this. My father deserved better, and maybe, just maybe, I deserved better too. Over the next few days I watched Leora carefully. I'd always been observant, another trait my mother had noticed, but one that had its dark side. I could be obsessive when I fixated on something, turning it over and over in my mind until I'd examined every angle. Now I watched my wife with new eyes, cataloguing every interaction, every word, every gesture. She acted like nothing had happened. She laughed at shows on television, chatted on the phone with her friends, complained about work. My father, meanwhile, moved through the house like a shadow. He didn't light the candle again. He didn't bring up the incident. But I saw how he avoided looking at Leora, how he found reasons to be in different rooms. How something vital had dimmed in his eyes. The playful man who used to tell terrible jokes at dinner, who used to hum while he cooked, who used to call my mother his sunshine even after 40 years of marriage, that man was disappearing a little more each day. I started going through old papers in my father's study, ostensibly helping him organize things. He'd mentioned wanting to update his will, make sure everything was in order, and I'd offered to help gather the necessary documents. What I found made my blood run cold, but also gave me an idea, the first threads of a plan forming in my mind. My father's estate, everything he owned including this house, was substantial. He'd been a successful architect before retiring, had invested wisely, had paid off the mortgage decades ago. But more importantly, I discovered that he'd set up a trust years ago, back when my mother was first diagnosed. The terms were specific. Upon his death, everything would go to me, yes, but it was structured in a way that protected the assets. And Leora's name wasn't anywhere in those documents. Because we'd gotten married after the trust was established, and my father had never updated it to include her. At first I felt guilty for even noticing this, for letting this information plant seeds in my mind. But then I'd remember those scattered flowers, my father's broken expression, the casual cruelty in Leora's voice, and the guilt would evaporate. I started pulling more documents, getting everything organized under the guise of being helpful. My father seemed grateful for the assistance, not knowing I was building something else entirely. One evening, about a week after the candle incident, I found him in my mother's garden, the one she'd spent years cultivating, now somewhat overgrown but still beautiful in its wild way. He was sitting on the stone bench they'd picked out together, just sitting and staring at the roses. "Dad," I said softly, not wanting to startle him. He looked up and I saw he'd been crying. "I'm sorry, Adrian," he said, wiping his eyes quickly. "I know I need to be stronger. Your mother wouldn't want me falling apart like this." I sat down beside him, the stone cold even through my jeans. "Mom would want you to grieve however you need to," I told him. "She'd want you to remember her, to honor her. What Leora said, what she did, that was wrong." He was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands folded in his lap. "I don't want to cause problems between you and your wife," he finally said. "Maybe she's right, maybe I do need to move on." The defeat in his voice broke something in me. This man had raised me, had taught me about integrity and kindness and love. He'd shown me what a good marriage looked like, what it meant to honor your commitments and cherish another person. And now, he was apologizing for grieving the loss of his soulmate. "She's not right," I said firmly, "and you don't need to apologize for loving Mom, for missing her, for wanting to remember her. You never need to apologize for that." My father looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something like relief flicker across his face. "Thank you," he whispered. We sat there in the growing darkness, surrounded by my mother's roses, and I made a decision. I was going to fix this. I was going to make Leora understand what she'd done. And if she couldn't understand, if she couldn't see the depth of her cruelty, then I was going to make sure she faced consequences. My impulsiveness, that flaw my mother had tried to help me control, was warring with my tendency to overthink. Part of me wanted to confront Leora immediately, to throw her out, to burn everything down. But the calculating part of my brain, the part that planned and strategized, knew that acting rashly would only make things worse. I needed to be smart about this. I needed to be thorough. That night, I started really digging into the trust documents, making copies, highlighting relevant sections. I also started thinking about other things, other instances where Leora had shown this side of herself. The time she'd mocked my father for crying during a movie that reminded him of my mother. The way she'd rolled her eyes when he'd wanted to visit the cemetery on what would have been my parents' 45th wedding anniversary. The impatient sighs when he'd tell stories about my mother at dinner. I dismissed all of it, made excuses, told myself she just didn't understand. But now I saw it clearly. She'd been showing me who she was all along, and I'd been too blind, too stubborn, too conflict avoidant to see it. Another one of my flaws, that tendency to avoid seeing problems until they exploded in my face. My mother used to say I had a gift for denial, for convincing myself everything was fine until it absolutely wasn't. Over the next few days, Leora seemed to sense that something had shifted. She'd catch me watching her and her expression would harden. "What?" she'd snap. "Nothing," I'd reply, keeping my voice neutral. "You're being weird," she accused one evening. "Am I?" I asked, not looking up from my laptop. "Yes, you've barely spoken to me in a week. If you're going to be mad about the candle thing, just say so." The candle thing. Like it was some minor disagreement about what to have for dinner, not a deliberate act of cruelty toward a grieving man. I felt anger spike in my chest, hot and sharp, but I pushed it down. Not yet. I wasn't ready yet. "I'm not mad," I lied. "I'm just busy with work." She didn't believe me, I could tell, but she also didn't push it. That was the thing about Leora. She liked to avoid deep emotional conversations as much as I liked to avoid confrontation. We were a perfect storm of dysfunction in that way. The marriage had been good at first, or I'd thought it was. She was smart, beautiful, successful in her career as a marketing executive. She'd seemed supportive when my mother got sick, had moved in to help when I'd asked. But looking back now, I wondered how much of that had been genuine and how much had been performance. Had she always been this person, this cold, dismissive woman, or had something changed, and did it even matter at this point? I went through my father's financial records more thoroughly, making notes, building a complete picture of his assets. The house alone was worth nearly $1 million, situated in a neighborhood that had appreciated significantly over the years. Then there were the retirement accounts, the investment portfolios, the life insurance policy that had paid out when my mother died. All of it was substantial. All of it was protected in the trust, and none of it had Leora's name attached. I realized that she probably assumed she'd inherit alongside me, that as my wife she'd automatically be entitled to half of everything. It's what most people would assume. But the way the trust was structured, the way my father's will was written, that wasn't how it would work. Everything would flow into the trust first, then to me as the sole beneficiary, with specific protections that prevented it from being considered marital property. The idea that had been forming in my mind became clearer. I didn't just want to confront Leora about what she'd done. I wanted her to understand the full consequences of her cruelty. I wanted her to realize that her callousness toward my father, her dismissal of my mother's memory, had cost her something real and tangible. But more than that, I wanted her out of our lives, out of my father's house, out of our family. Because she'd revealed herself to be someone who didn't belong here, someone who didn't understand or respect what we valued most. I knew I was being harsh, probably too harsh. My tendency to go from 0 to 100 when I finally did take action was kicking in. But every time I felt guilty, I'd remember my father's face when she blew out that candle, and the guilt would disappear. I scheduled a meeting with my father's estate attorney, using the excuse that I wanted to make sure we had everything properly organized. The attorney, an older woman named Patricia who'd known my parents for years, reviewed everything with me. "Your father set this up very carefully," she explained. "The trust is irrevocable. All assets flow through it. As his sole beneficiary, you'll inherit everything, but the trust protections mean that it's separate from any marital assets. Your wife wouldn't have any claim to it, even in the event of a divorce." She said this matter-of-factly, not knowing she was handing me the ammunition I needed. "I see," I said carefully. "And if I wanted to make sure my father understood these protections, make sure he knew exactly how his estate was structured." Patricia looked at me over her glasses, and I had the distinct impression she could read between the lines. "I think it would be very responsible of you to review all of this with your father," she said. "Make sure he understands exactly what he set up and why. Sometimes people forget the specific terms of these arrangements." I left her office with copies of everything, my mind racing. I was building towards something, I could feel it, but I needed the timing to be right. I needed all the pieces in place. That night I found my father in the living room, watching an old movie. I sat down beside him, the documents in a folder on my lap. "Dad, I need to talk to you about your estate planning," I said. He looked worried immediately. "Is something wrong? Did I mess something up?" His instant anxiety reminded me how fragile he'd become since my mother's death, how much confidence he'd lost. "No, nothing's wrong," I assured him. "I just want to make sure you understand how everything is set up. I've been going through the documents, and I think it's important we review them together." We spent the next hour going through everything. I explained the trust, how it worked, what it protected. I showed him the beneficiary designations, the will provisions, all of it. He listened carefully, occasionally asking questions, and I could see him starting to understand. "So Leora," he said slowly, "she's not part of any of this." I shook my head. "The trust was set up before we got married, and the way it's structured, even though she's my wife, the assets are protected. They can't be considered marital property because they're held in trust." My father was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "Does she know this?" he asked. "I don't think so," I admitted. "Most people assume that spouses automatically inherit or have rights to estates, but that's not always how it works, especially with trusts." My father looked at me, and I saw something in his expression I hadn't seen in a long time: shrewdness, understanding. The sharp intelligence that had made him such a successful architect. "You're planning something," he said softly. "I could have denied it, should have denied it, but I was tired of hiding, tired of pretending, tired of swallowing my anger. What she did to you, to Mom's memory, it was wrong," I said. "And she hasn't apologized, hasn't even acknowledged it. She thinks she can treat you however she wants, dismiss your grief, disrespect Mom, and there won't be any consequences." My father's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't look away. "What are you going to do?" he asked. "I'm going to show her that actions have consequences," I said. "I'm going to make her understand what she's lost by being so cruel. And then, Dad, I'm going to ask her to leave." I expected him to protest, to tell me not to ruin my marriage over this, to try to smooth things over, but instead he just nodded slowly. "Your mother would tell you to be careful," he said. "She'd tell you that revenge doesn't heal anything, that it just creates more pain." I felt my throat tighten. "I know," I whispered. "But she'd also tell you," my father continued, "that some things are worth fighting for, that love and memory and respect matter, that sometimes you have to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." He reached over and squeezed my hand. "I trust you, son. Whatever you decide to do, I trust you." That trust, that faith in me made me more determined than ever. But it also scared me because I knew my flaws. I knew I could go too far, let my anger drive me to do something I'd regret. I knew I could be too harsh, too unforgiving, too quick to burn bridges once I'd finally made up my mind to act. But I also knew I couldn't just let this go. My mother deserved better. My father deserved better. And maybe, somewhere deep down, I needed to prove to myself that I could stand up for what mattered, that I wasn't just going to avoid conflict forever. The confrontation came exactly 2 weeks after the candle incident. I'd spent those weeks carefully preparing, getting all my ducks in a row, making sure I understood every legal and financial implication of what I was about to do. I'd also spent those weeks watching Leora, cataloguing her continued dismissal of my father, her casual cruelty disguised as practicality. She'd suggested he sell the house and move into a smaller place. She'd thrown away a photo album she found in the living room, calling it clutter. She'd made a joke about widows being pathetic that made my father leave the dinner table. Each instance was another nail in the coffin of our marriage, another piece of evidence that I was making the right choice. I chose a Saturday evening, when I knew we'd all be home, when there'd be time for everything that needed to be said. I set up the living room deliberately, placing the folder of documents on the coffee table, arranging chairs so we'd all be facing each other. My father came in first, looking nervous but resolved. He sat in his usual chair, the one he'd always shared with my mother, watching movies and reading books together. Then Leora appeared from the kitchen, wine glass in hand, immediately suspicious. "What's this?" she asked, seeing the formal arrangement. "A family meeting." There was mockery in her tone, but also wariness. "Sit down," I said calmly. "We need to talk." She rolled her eyes but sat, crossing her legs and taking a sip of wine. "If this is about the candle thing again, I'm really not interested in rehashing it." I said what I said. "I'm not apologizing for being honest." "This is about a lot more than the candle," I said, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. "This is about respect, about cruelty, about understanding what you've lost through your actions." Leora's eyes narrowed. "What I've lost, what's that supposed to mean?" I picked up the folder and opened it, pulling out the first document. "Do you know what a trust is, Leora?" I asked. She blinked, thrown by the change in direction. "Of course I know what a trust is. Why?" I slid the document across the table to her. "This is my father's estate plan. Everything he owns, everything he's spent 40 years building, is held in an irrevocable trust." She glanced at the papers, confusion evident on her face. "Okay, so what?" Her tone was impatient, dismissive, the same tone she'd used when she blew out that candle. So, I continued, that means that upon his death, everything flows through the trust to the designated beneficiary. Not through probate, not through a normal will process, but directly through the trust. I pulled out another document, and this is the beneficiary designation. Would you like to guess whose name is on it? Leora's face had gone pale, and I saw her throat work as she swallowed. I assume yours, she said carefully. That's right, I confirmed. Mine, sole beneficiary. Everything goes to me held in trust, protected from being considered marital property. The wine glass in her hand trembled slightly. What are you saying? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm saying that you have no claim to any of this, I said, gesturing around the house. Not this house, not his retirement accounts, not his investments, nothing. The trust protects all of it. You're not part of the estate plan, you never were. That's not possible, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. We're married, I'm entitled to half of whatever you inherit. I shook my head and I could feel my anger starting to break through the careful control I'd maintained. No, you're not. The trust was established before we got married. The assets are separate. Legally, completely separate. Our estate attorney confirmed it. I pulled out the letter from Patricia, her official letterhead at the top, outlining exactly what I'd just explained. Leora grabbed it, her hands shaking now, her eyes scanning the legal language. I watched the realization dawn on her face, watched her understand what this meant. You planned this, she said accusingly. You've been planning this whole thing. Yes, I admitted. Since the night you blew out my mother's memorial candle, since you threw her flowers in the trash like they were garbage, since you told my father to get over the love of his life, to stop grieving like grief has an expiration date. My voice was rising now, the control slipping. I've been planning this since you showed me who you really are. Leora stood up, the documents falling from her lap. This is insane. You're going to throw away our marriage because I was honest about your father's pathetic mourning ritual. There it was again, that word, pathetic, applied to my father's grief, to his love, to everything that mattered most. It wasn't honest, I said, standing too. It was cruel. There's a difference, Leora. Honesty without compassion is just cruelty with an excuse. Oh please, she snapped, her fear transforming into anger. Don't pretend to be some noble defender. You're just looking for a reason to end this marriage. You've probably been unhappy for months. She wasn't entirely wrong. I had been unhappy, but I hadn't fully admitted it to myself until that night with the candle. Maybe I have been, I said, but I didn't see it clearly until you showed me, until you demonstrated that you have no empathy, no respect for grief, no understanding of what it means to love someone so deeply that losing them breaks you. My father spoke up then, his voice quiet but firm. Grief isn't a performance, Leora. It's not weakness. It's love that has nowhere to go. My wife was my partner for 40 years. She was my best friend, my confidant, the mother of my child. When she died, a part of me died too. And the only way I know how to honor what we had is to remember her, to keep her memory alive, to light a candle on the anniversary of her passing and say out loud that she mattered, that she still matters. Leora turned to him, her face flushed. And that's fine, Elias, mourn however you want, but don't expect everyone else to participate in your grief parade year after year. It's depressing, it's morbid, it keeps you stuck in the past. My father's expression hardened in a way I'd rarely seen. The past is all I have left of her, he said. And if respecting that is too much to ask, if basic human decency towards someone who's lost their partner is beyond you, then maybe Adrian is right. Maybe you don't belong in this family. The room went silent. Outside, I could hear the wind chimes my mother had hung on the porch, their gentle melody somehow making this moment more surreal. Leora looked between us, and I saw something like panic cross her face. You're both being ridiculous, she said, but her voice had lost its edge. This is an overreaction to something minor. It's not minor to me, I said, and it's clearly not minor to my father. The fact that you think it is, that you can't see why blowing out a memorial candle and throwing away flowers on the anniversary of someone's death might be hurtful, that tells me everything I need to know about who you are. I took a breath, steadying myself. I want you to move out, Leora. I want a divorce. She laughed, but it was a bitter, hollow sound. Based on what? One argument. One moment where I didn't coddle your father's feelings. Her voice rose. You can't be serious. You're going to end our marriage over this. I felt my temper flaring, that tendency I had to go from controlled to explosive once I'd finally made up my mind. I'm ending our marriage because you're cruel, I said, my voice hard. Because you lack basic empathy. Because you see grief as weakness and love as something that should have an expiration date. Because in the 2 weeks since that night, you haven't once apologized or shown even a hint of remorse. Because you just called my father's mourning pathetic again, even now, even knowing how much it hurts him. So what? She shot back. I'm supposed to fake sympathy I don't feel, pretend I think it's healthy for him to be stuck in this endless cycle of grief. She gestured wildly around the room. This whole house is a shrine to a dead woman. Every room has her pictures, her things, her presence. It's creepy, Adrian. And instead of helping your father move on, you're enabling him, encouraging him to stay stuck in the past. My hands clenched into fists at my sides. I wanted to scream at her to make her understand, but my father spoke first. This house is a shrine to 40 years of love, he said, his voice shaking but strong. These pictures, these things, they represent a life built together. They represent someone who mattered, who loved and was loved. And yes, I'm stuck. Yes, I'm grieving, but that's my right. I earned that right through 40 years of marriage, through being there when she was sick, through holding her hand when she died. I earned the right to mourn her however I need to. Leora threw up her hands. Fine, mourn her, but I don't have to participate in it, and I don't have to pretend it's healthy or normal. She turned back to me. And you can't seriously expect me to leave our home over this. The words came out before I could stop them, harsh and final. It's not our home, Leora, it's my father's home. The home he shared with my mother. The home you've been disrespecting since we moved in. And yes, I expect you to leave. I'm asking you to leave. Her face went white, then red, emotions playing across her features too fast to track. You bastard, she whispered. You're really doing this. You're really choosing your dead mother and your pathetic father over your wife. The word pathetic again, like a slap. It crystallized everything, made my decision feel not just right, but necessary. Every single time, I said. I would choose them over you every single time, because they know how to love. They know what loyalty means. They know that some things matter more than convenience or comfort. You don't. Leora grabbed her wine glass, and for a moment I thought she might throw it. Instead, she drained it in one long swallow. You'll regret this, she said, her voice venomous. When you're alone, when you've realized you threw away a good marriage over some symbolic candle, you'll regret it. I shook my head. The only thing I regret is not seeing who you were sooner. Not standing up to you the first time you were cruel to my father. Not defending my mother's memory from the beginning. I pulled out another document, the separation agreement I'd drawn up. You can stay in the guest room tonight if you need to, but I want you out by tomorrow. We can handle the divorce proceedings through attorneys, but I'm not going to fight you on the marital assets. The apartment downtown that we bought together, you can have it. The savings account in both our names, split it down the middle. I'll be fair about everything that's actually ours together. But my father's estate, this house, anything from before we were married, that's off limits. You have no claim to it, and you never will. She snatched the separation agreement from my hand, her eyes scanning it quickly. This is already drawn up, she said incredulously. You've been planning this for weeks. I nodded, not ashamed. Yes, because I knew once I saw who you really were, there was no going back. I knew I couldn't stay married to someone who could be so casually cruel. Leora's expression shifted, and I saw tears forming in her eyes. For a moment I wondered if they were real, if somewhere under the anger and defensiveness there was genuine regret. Adrian, please, she said, her voice breaking. We can work through this. I'll apologize to Elias. I'll try to be more understanding. Don't throw everything away. But even as she said it, I could hear the calculation in her voice. This wasn't remorse. This was strategy. She was trying to find an angle, a way to salvage what she thought she was entitled to. It's too late, I said, and I meant it. You can't unring this bell, Leora. You can't undo what you've shown me. I felt my father's hand on my shoulder, steady and supportive. I think you should go pack your things, he said to Leora, his voice gentle but firm. You can stay tonight if you need to, but Adrian is right. This can't continue. Leora looked at him, and I saw real hatred flash across her face. You did this, she said to my father. You poisoned him against me with your endless grieving and your weakness. This is your fault. My father didn't flinch. No, he said quietly. You did this when you showed disrespect for my wife's memory, when you demonstrated that you have no capacity for compassion. This is entirely your doing, Leora. She stood there for another moment, trembling with rage or fear or some combination of both. Then she turned and stalked out of the room. We heard her footsteps on the stairs, heard the bedroom door slam, heard drawers opening and closing violently. My father and I sat back down, both of us silent, the weight of what had just happened settling over us like a heavy blanket. Are you okay? My father asked after a while. I thought about it, really thought about it. Was I okay? I just ended my marriage, confronted my wife, set in motion a series of events that would change everything. But I also felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, relief, like I could finally breathe again. Yeah, I said, I think I am. My father nodded, his eyes wet with tears. Your mother would be proud of you, he said softly, for standing up for what's right, even though it hurt. I felt my own tears starting to fall then. I miss her, Dad, I whispered, every day. He pulled me into a hug, and we sat there in that living room, in the house my mother had made a home, and we grieved together the way we should have been allowed to all along. Leora left the next morning. She'd packed most of her things into suitcases and boxes, loading them into her car with sharp, angry movements. I watched from the window, not helping, not hindering, just observing. She made 3 trips, and on the final one she came back inside. I was sitting in the living room, the same room where we'd had our confrontation, and she stood in the doorway looking at me. I hope you know what you've done, she said, her voice cold. I hope when you're old and alone like your father you remember this moment, remember that you chose this. I met her gaze steadily. I will remember, I said, and I'll be glad I did. She shook her head, lips pressed into a thin line. You're going to regret this, Adrian. Someday you'll realize that what I said wasn't cruel, it was honest, that your father does need to move on, that I was trying to help. I almost laughed at the revisionist history already taking place in her mind. If you need to believe that to live with yourself, go ahead, I said, but we both know the truth. She left without another word, and I heard her car start, heard the engine fade as she drove away. My father came and stood beside me at the window, watching the empty driveway. How do you feel? He asked. Relieved, I admitted. Sad, angry, uncertain, all of it at once. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. That's normal. Ending a relationship, even one that wasn't healthy, it's still a loss. You're allowed to grieve it. We were both quiet for a long moment. Then my father went to the mantel and picked up the white candle that Leora had blown out 2 weeks earlier. He'd saved it, I realized, kept it even though it represented that horrible moment. Should we light it? He asked. I nodded, and together we stood there as he struck a match and brought the flame to the wick. This time it burned steady and bright. She mattered, my father said again, his voice stronger now. She still matters. I squeezed his shoulder. Always, I agreed. The aftermath wasn't easy. The divorce proceedings took months, and Leora fought me on more than I'd expected, trying to claim that the trust assets should be considered marital property despite the legal protections. She lost, as I'd known she would, but it cost time and attorney fees and emotional energy. My friends were split on whether I'd done the right thing. Some thought I'd overreacted, that I should have tried counseling, that ending a marriage over one incident was too extreme. Others understood, especially those who'd known my mother, who'd seen the kind of love my parents had shared. The ones who questioned my decision, I let them question. I didn't need everyone to understand. I knew what I'd seen in Leora's eyes that night. I knew what her cruelty had revealed. And I knew I'd made the right choice, even if it was a hard one. My father and I settled into a new routine. I stayed living with him, not out of obligation now, but out of choice. We cooked dinners together, watched old movies, worked on restoring my mother's garden. On the anniversary of her death the following year, we lit the candle together without anyone there to blow it out. We set out fresh lilies, we told stories about her, we laughed and cried and remembered. And it felt right. It felt like honoring something sacred. I started dating again eventually, cautiously, with new awareness of what I was looking for in a partner. Someone who understood that grief was part of love, that respecting the past didn't mean being stuck in it, that compassion mattered more than almost anything else. I didn't find that person right away, but I was okay with that. I was learning to be comfortable alone, to not need someone else to complete me. But sometimes, late at night, I'd think about Leora's parting words, about ending up old and alone, about regretting my choice. And I'd wonder if maybe she was partly right, if maybe I'd been too harsh, too unforgiving, too quick to burn everything down once I'd finally decided to act. That flaw of mine, going from 0 to 100, from avoidance to total destruction with nothing in between, it had definitely played a role. Maybe if I'd confronted her immediately, if I'd given her a chance to apologize before I'd started planning her exit, things might have been different. Maybe if I'd tried counseling, if I'd communicated my hurt instead of just watching and calculating, we could have salvaged something. These thoughts would creep in during weak moments, making me question everything. But then I'd remember my father's face when she blew out that candle. I'd remember the casual cruelty in her voice, the way she'd thrown away those flowers, the fact that she never once apologized or showed genuine remorse. I'd remember that even during our confrontation, even when faced with losing her marriage, she'd still called my father pathetic. And I'd know that my choice, however flawed the path to it might have been, was ultimately the right one. Some people show you who they are in small moments. Leora had shown me in that one act of blowing out a memorial candle everything I needed to know about her capacity for empathy, her understanding of love, her ability to respect grief and loss. And once I'd seen it, I couldn't unsee it. Maybe that made me unforgiving, maybe it made me harsh, but it also made me honest with myself in a way I hadn't been before. The real consequence of my revenge, if you could call it that, wasn't just Leora losing access to my father's estate. It wasn't even the end of our marriage. The real consequence was the clarity it brought me about myself, about my own flaws and patterns. I saw how I'd avoided confrontation for so long that when I finally did confront her, I did it with nuclear force. I saw how I could be calculating and cold when I felt betrayed, how I could plan someone's exit with the same methodical precision I'd once applied to planning our wedding. I saw my capacity for cutting people out completely once they'd crossed a line, no second chances, no grace, just done. These weren't necessarily admirable qualities, and they scared me a little. They reminded me that I was capable of my own brand of cruelty, even if I justified it as justice. My father noticed my occasional melancholy, the moments when I'd get quiet and withdrawn. One evening, about a year after Leora had left, he sat down beside me in the garden. "You're thinking about her," he said. It wasn't a question, I nodded. Sometimes, wondering if I did the right thing, if I was too harsh. My father was quiet for a moment, his weathered hands folded in his lap. "Your mother used to say that the hardest part of loving someone was accepting their flaws while still holding them accountable for their actions," he said. "She'd tell you that yes, you have flaws. Yes, you could have handled things differently, but that doesn't mean Leora's actions were acceptable. Both things can be true." I felt tears prick my eyes. I miss Mom's wisdom, I said. She always knew what to say. My father smiled sadly. She did. But she also taught us to think for ourselves, to trust our own judgment. You made a choice based on what you knew to be true. That's all any of us can do. As time passed, I heard through mutual friends that Leora had gotten engaged to someone new, was moving on with her life. I felt a strange mixture of relief and something else, something I couldn't quite name. Relief that she'd found someone else, that I wasn't leaving her devastated and alone, but also a kind of vindication, maybe, that she'd moved on so quickly. It confirmed what I'd suspected, that our marriage hadn't meant as much to her as it should have, that she was capable of replacing people and relationships without much difficulty. That thought should have made me angry, but instead it just made me sad. Sad for what we'd lost, sad for what we'd never really had, sad for the future we'd planned that would never happen, but not regretful, never regretful of my decision to end it. My father lived for another 5 years after that night with the candle. 5 good years where we grew closer, where he slowly found peace with my mother's death, where he started to smile more and the heaviness in his eyes began to lift. He never dated again, never even considered it. Your mother was it for me, he'd say when people asked. Some people get one great love in their lifetime. I got 40 years with mine, that's more than most people ever get. When he died peacefully in his sleep at 73, I found a letter he'd written to me, tucked away in his desk. In it, he thanked me for standing up for him that night, for defending his right to grieve, for showing him that his love for my mother mattered. You have your own flaws, son, he'd written. Your tendency to avoid conflict until you explode, your unforgiving nature once someone has crossed you, your capacity for coldness when you feel betrayed. But you also have the capacity for fierce loyalty, for standing up for what's right even when it's hard, for loving deeply and honestly. Those qualities you got from your mother, I hope you remember them. Even when you're struggling with your flaws, love and loyalty matter more than perfection. Now sitting in this house that's mine now, legally and completely, surrounded by pictures of my parents and memories of my mother, I think about that night often. The night I watched my wife blow out a memorial candle and knew in that instant that my marriage was over. Was I right to end it? Yes. Would I do it again? Absolutely. But would I handle it the same way, with weeks of cold calculation and a confrontation designed to make her feel the full weight of what she'd lost? Maybe not. Maybe I'd try to confront her sooner, communicate my hurt more openly, give her more of a chance to understand and apologize. Or maybe not. Maybe some cruelties don't deserve second chances. Maybe some revelations of character are so fundamental that no apology can fix them. What I know for certain is this: grief is love with nowhere to go, just like my father said. And anyone who can't respect that, who can't honor the depth of another person's loss, who thinks mourning has an expiration date or that memorial rituals are pathetic, that person doesn't understand love at all. Leora taught me that. She taught me that some people are only capable of surface-level connection, that empathy isn't universal, that cruelty often disguises itself as honesty. And while the way I handled it revealed my own capacity for calculated coldness, for going from controlled to explosive with nothing in between, it also revealed my capacity for protecting what matters, for standing up for love, even love that's transformed into grief, for honoring memory and loyalty and the sacred rituals that help us process loss. My mother mattered, she still matters, and anyone who can't understand that has no place in my life. That's the lesson I learned from blowing out a candle, from scattered lilies, from my revenge that was really just consequences, from love that demanded to be honored even in death, and I wouldn't change it for anything.